Shockwaves are rippling through the United Kingdom as Buckingham Palace has just confirmed heartbreaking news about King Charles's long-rumored abdication. After months of speculation, the official announcement has revealed the exact date the king plans to step down. And it's left the entire nation in disbelief. Behind the palace walls, emotions are running high as this historic moment approaches sooner than anyone expected. What pushed Charles to make this painful decision? Stay with us, because what happens next could change the monarchy forever. The day the crown trembled. His Majesty has reached a final decision regarding the timeline of his abdication. Those words, spoken in the polished calm of a Buckingham Palace briefing room, carried the weight of thunder. For months, speculation had filled newspapers and airwaves, but now, at last, the whispers had turned to fact. The palace's spokesperson delivered the statement with deliberate precision, yet behind that restraint was an unmistakable tremor. It wasn't just news, it was history unfolding in real time. Veteran royal correspondents who'd covered coronations and scandals alike described the moment as chillingly intimate. Less a press briefing, more a quiet revolution. This wasn't a rumor or a trial balloon. It was the end of a reign that once felt immovable. King Charles III, the monarch who had waited a lifetime to ascend, had chosen to let go. As the briefing ended, the room dissolved into a flurry of movement. Reporters fired off breaking alerts, camera shutters snapped relentlessly, and royal aides, trained in centuries of composure, struggled to mask their emotions. Some stood pale and rigid, their lips pressed thin. Others blinked rapidly, caught between duty and disbelief. One journalist later said it felt as though the palace itself was holding its breath. Outside the gates, hundreds gathered under the grey London sky, drawn by instinct more than announcement. There was no cheering, no jubilation, only a haunting stillness, broken by murmured questions. Was it his health? Was it pressure from within the royal family? Or weighted the crown, after decades of waiting, proven too much to bear? The palace offered no answers. Only a date, undisclosed to the public, was said to have been quietly set. Yet that detail alone sparked a storm of speculation. Reporters and historians scrambled to decipher its meaning. Was it chosen to align with a personal anniversary? Perhaps the date of his mother's coronation? Or a milestone in his own life? Every theory seemed plausible, yet none were confirmed. What was clear, however, was that this was not a decision made overnight. Behind closed doors, senior royals had been informed only hours before the announcement. Some received brief, carefully worded phone calls. Others, according to insiders, learned of the decision through aides moments before it hit the press. The abruptness was staggering. For a monarch known for his caution and contemplation, this was a move of startling speed and finality. The revelation signaled more than an impending abdication. It revealed a transition already in motion. Quiet meetings, sealed documents, and private discussions had paved the way for weeks, perhaps months. The statement was merely the public unveiling of a process long underway. The machinery of monarchy was turning, and there was no stopping it now. But behind that polished announcement lies a deeper truth, a story of exhaustion, conflict, and emotional reckoning. What finally pushed King Charles III to surrender the crown he had waited his whole life to wear? To understand that, we must step into the private corridors of the palace itself, where loyalty, love, and legacy collided in a storm no royal training could prepare him for. But what if the real breaking point wasn't duty or age, but a secret buried deep within the palace walls themselves? Keep watching. The crown's final burden. It began quietly, subtle fatigue, cautious words from doctors, and worried glances exchanged behind palace walls. King Charles III, the man who had once embodied endurance and destiny, was showing the unmistakable strain of a crown that had come too late. For over 70 years, Charles had lived in waiting, his entire life defined by a role that hovered just beyond reach. He became the longest-serving heir in British history, preparing endlessly for the day he would finally rule. Yet when that long-awaited moment arrived, it was not the triumph he had imagined. It was a test. His reign, though symbolically powerful, was brief, its brightness shadowed by the relentless toll of expectation. The crown, that gleaming emblem of duty and stability, seemed to grow heavier by the day. Those close to him saw the difference immediately. The spark that once animated his speeches began to fade. After public engagements, he would retreat in silence, his steps slower, his shoulders stooped beneath the invisible weight of tradition. Within the palace, the signs multiplied. Personal physicians exchanged uneasy looks. Senior aides began noting his increasing absences, his dwindling appetite for the endless cycle of ceremonies and councils. There were no dramatic collapses, no public alarms, only the slow erosion of energy from a man who had given every ounce of himself to a role that no longer seemed to give back. To outsiders, he appeared dignified as ever. But those inside knew the truth. The monarchy was quietly adjusting to what was coming. Little by little, duties were passed on. William and Catherine stepped forward, their appearances at major events subtly increasing. Official explanations spoke of modernization and shared responsibility. But behind the phrasing was a quiet choreography of transition. The younger royals were not merely assisting, they were rehearsing. Every new engagement they undertook was a thread being woven into a future that was fast approaching. Charles, meanwhile, began to withdraw from the center of decision-making. Meetings that once stretched late into the night grew shorter, sometimes delegated entirely to trusted aides. His involvement, once meticulous and personal, started to wane. It wasn't indifference, it was exhaustion. The man who had spent a lifetime preparing to serve was beginning to realize that even kings are not immune to time's quiet theft. Friends and confidants spoke of a shift in him, less concern about legacy, more reflection on endurance. For the first time, the monarch who had always placed duty above all else was asking the most forbidden question of all: where does the crown end and the man begin? The answer, it seemed, was drawing closer with each passing day. By the time the palace's doctors voiced their deepest concerns, the decision was already forming within him. The choice between loyalty to the throne and loyalty to his own humanity was no longer theoretical. It was urgent. And, in the hushed echoing corridors of Balmoral Castle, far from the public eye, a conversation began. One that would set into motion the most consequential decision of King Charles III's life: the abdication of the British throne. And how do you choose between duty and survival when both carry the weight of a crown? The answer would change everything. The warning that changed everything. It was Princess Anne who broke the silence. For weeks, she had watched the quiet changes rippling through Buckingham Palace. The subtle shifts in tone, the rearranged schedules, the way courtiers began addressing certain people with new deference. When she finally confronted her brother, her voice carried the weight of both love and alarm. "They're preparing for a throne without you," she said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a prophecy. Anne had always been more than just Charles's sister. She was his anchor. Pragmatic, loyal, and one of the few people within the royal circle unafraid to speak unvarnished truth. While others softened their words in the language of protocol, Anne cut through the ceremony with a bluntness that only deep trust could allow. As the eldest daughter of Queen Elizabeth II, she had endured the same lifelong burden of duty and the same unrelenting gaze of the public. Their bond was not built on power, but on shared endurance. And that made her warning impossible to dismiss. she had sensed what the doctors and advisors had not said outright. The palace, that centuries-old fortress of loyalty, was realigning itself. Not in rebellion, but in quiet inevitability. Courtiers who once hung on Charles's every word now directed their attention toward William and Catherine. Invitations to high-level briefings were worded differently. Subtle omissions crept into schedules. The monarch was still the head of state, yet the machinery beneath him had begun to shift gears. Slowly, silently, but unmistakably. Anne watched as this invisible transformation took shape. It wasn't a single act of betrayal, but 1,000 quiet gestures. A new advisor here, a discreet change of seating there. A briefing led by someone who no longer deferred to the king's input. The monarchy, she realized, was already rehearsing for a post-Charles era. And while the public saw only ceremony and smiles, inside the palace, a succession was unfolding long before any official announcement. When Anne confronted Charles in the privacy of his study, her words carried urgency and sorrow in equal measure. "You have to take control of this," she told him, "because if you don't, someone else will." She wasn't urging rebellion. She was pleading for agency. She understood what her brother perhaps did not, that once the palace decided to move on, even the king could become a spectator to his own downfall. Behind the gates, William and Catherine's presence was expanding with almost imperceptible grace. Courtiers, ever alert to shifting winds, began aligning themselves accordingly. William's meetings grew longer. Catherine's engagements took on the tone and polish of a queen in waiting. They weren't plotting. They were preparing, carefully, dutifully, inevitably. Anne's warning exposed what no press release ever could, that the monarchy was already transitioning, not years from now, but in real time. And while her words came from love, they carried an unspoken truth, that power in the palace doesn't simply vanish. It moves. It reorganizes. It anticipates. And in the quiet corridors where portraits of past kings stare down from gilded walls, the balance of that power had already begun to shift toward the next chapter. For Charles, the realization was shattering. The decision he thought was still his to make was already being written around him. His abdication, once a possibility, was fast becoming a necessity, not just for his health, but for the survival of the institution he had spent his life defending. And as the machinery of succession gained unstoppable momentum, the king who had waited longer than any in history to rule was now being quietly prepared to step aside. So, how do you measure the moment a king stops being a symbol and starts being a man? Stay tuned. The silent shift of power. A gentle tilt within the palace walls that only those closest to the throne could feel. The center of royal gravity was moving inch by inch, from the reigning monarch to the one waiting just behind him. To the public, it looked like duty was continuing as usual. But inside Buckingham Palace, those who understood the rhythm of royal life recognized it for what it was: preparation. The future was being assembled quietly, and its shape was no longer defined by King Charles III. In the meeting rooms and corridors where generations of advisors had served Charles with unwavering loyalty, the tone began to change. It wasn't rebellion, nor disloyalty, it was instinct. The monarchy has always been a living organism, one that adapts to time and transition. And as Charles's strength waned, those instincts drew senior courtiers toward William. He was no longer merely the heir. He was becoming the inevitable. Meetings that once began with one day now started with "When you are king." Reports that used to be sent to Charles were quietly copied to William. His briefings grew longer, his opinions carried new authority, and his vision for the monarchy began shaping official plans. Even the language within the palace corridors shifted, subtle but undeniable. The old guard had begun to follow a new compass, and the heir's shadow was stretching far beyond its natural reach. Through this evolving landscape, Catherine emerged as the quiet center of balance. She was neither loud nor imposing, yet her influence was unmistakable. Her presence beside William brought both reassurance and strength, the calm of continuity mixed with the energy of renewal. She carried herself with the composure of a queen-in-waiting long before any official title would confirm it. Every public appearance, every carefully chosen word seemed to prepare the nation for what was to come. But behind that poise, tension simmered. William found himself torn between two worlds: the son who wished to stand by his father, and the heir who felt the machinery of monarchy urging him forward. In private, he began hosting discreet meetings with senior advisors, not to discuss if the transition would happen, but when. The discussions were quiet but meticulous. Ceremonial procedures, constitutional timing, and how to preserve his father's dignity through what was rapidly becoming unavoidable. The burden of inevitability weighed heavily. Outside, the press grew bolder. Headlines hinted at abdication. Opinion polls whispered of a new, modern crown. Public sentiment began to turn, imagining a younger monarch and a rejuvenated monarchy. And as William shouldered the quiet pressure of destiny, another figure within the royal household faced her own reckoning. Queen Camila, who had spent decades clawing her way from scandal to respect, found herself watching the life she had built begin to tremble. In the private rooms of Clarence House, she pleaded with Charles to reconsider. She feared not just for him, but for herself, for the role, the title, the identity she had fought to earn. She had weathered storms of public criticism, endured comparisons, and proved her devotion time and again. Yet now, she was facing an adversary far more powerful than opinion or gossip: time. For Camilla, abdication was not a political act. It was an erasure. Everything she had defended, the position she had finally secured, could vanish the moment Charles stepped aside. And as the palace moved forward in carefully measured silence, she understood the truth with aching clarity. Once the crown begins to turn, it never looks back. So how did the real cost of Charles's abdication not lie in the crown he gave up, but the legacy Camilla could never reclaim? Stay with us. A throne on the edge of farewell. Inside the ancient corridors of Buckingham Palace, the air had grown heavy, thick with unspoken fear, sorrow, and inevitability. The whispers that once circled quietly among courtiers had now become impossible to contain. King Charles III had made up his mind. The date of his abdication was no longer a rumor, but a fixed point in time, etched in secrecy, bound by purpose, and impossible to turn back. For Queen Camilla, the news felt like a slow, invisible storm pulling her world apart. The title she had fought so hard to earn, the one she had worn not only with pride but with resilience, now seemed destined to dissolve the moment Charles stepped down. Every conversation between them grew more emotional, every evening longer, filled with tension and tenderness that seemed to coexist painfully in the same breath. She pleaded with him to delay, to hold on, to reconsider the meaning of what he was surrendering. But Charles, weary and reflective, stood by his decision. To him, abdication was not an act of weakness, it was an act of preservation. He had spent decades waiting for the crown, only to discover that wearing it came at a cost too heavy to sustain. The pressures of modern monarchy, the constant public scrutiny, the health concerns whispered about in the press, all seemed to converge into a single truth he could no longer ignore. The institution he had vowed to protect needed renewal, and he believed that renewal must come through his departure. Camilla saw it differently. For her, the abdication marked not renewal but erasure. It threatened to reduce her entire journey. Years of struggle for acceptance, endless waves of public judgment, and the quiet triumph of finally being seen as queen. to a fading chapter in the shadow of a younger generation. She feared that once William and Catherine took center stage, her legacy would vanish in the retelling of royal history. Behind the palace gates, division took root. Senior advisors debated endlessly over the implications. Some agreed that a carefully timed transfer of power to Prince William would stabilize the monarchy and secure its future. Others feared the emotional cost, the disruption to the Queen Consort's standing, and the public confusion that might follow. Courtiers, torn by loyalty and ambition, began leaking fragments of the internal struggle to the press. Carefully, timed whispers appeared in newspapers, hinting at betrayal, heartbreak, and a queen fighting to hold on to relevance. In private, Camila reached out to the few allies she still trusted, those who understood what it meant to be overshadowed by history itself. She urged them to slow the transition, to preserve what fragments of influence she still held. But even her supporters could see the writing on the wall. The machinery of monarchy had already shifted into motion, precise and unstoppable. And behind the velvet curtains, Charles watched it all unfold in silence. The process of choosing the abdication date became a ritual of almost sacred weight. Each proposed day was studied for meaning, echoes of the past, symbols of closure, and the hope of renewal. When the final date was quietly underlined, it was done with reverence. It was not a random choice, it was a message, a final gesture from a king who had spent his life understanding the power of legacy and who now sought to leave one behind that would outlast his reign. The countdown had begun, and for the first time in generations, Britain braced itself for a royal farewell that would reshape not only the monarchy, but the very idea of what it meant to serve the crown. And now the farewell wasn't just the end of a reign, but the beginning of a secret transformation within the crown itself. The date that changed the crown. The decision wasn't just about a date on a calendar. It was a declaration, a quiet yet thunderous message to the nation and to history itself. King Charles III, ever the custodian of the monarchy's long and fragile narrative, approached it not as a logistical matter, but as a legacy-defining moment. Inside Buckingham Palace, the discussions were intense yet deeply symbolic. Every proposed date carried weight, each one a thread, connecting centuries of royal tradition with the uncertain dawn of a new era. Some advisors suggested a poetic symmetry, aligning the abdication with the anniversary of Queen Elizabeth II's accession, a gesture that would frame the event as a graceful passing of the torch. Others proposed more personal choices, dates tied to Charles's own milestones, moments that could lend an intimate humanity to a decision of monumental scale. The room buzzed with debate, but Charles remained still, silent, and contemplative, listening without interruption. Those who knew him best understood that this was his way, absorbing, reflecting, and measuring not only the historical implications, but the emotional gravity of what he was about to do. When the decision finally came, it felt inevitable. The chosen date was neither arbitrary nor purely ceremonial. It was selected with precision and meaning, a quiet bow to the past and a cautious nod to the future. Those present when he signed the final approval described the moment as almost sacred. The pen glided across paper, and with one deliberate stroke, centuries of continuity took a new turn. It was done. The end of Charles's reign had been set in motion. From that instant, the palace shifted into controlled urgency. Plans that had existed only as hypotheticals were suddenly thrust into reality. A discreet task force was assembled to manage every detail of what would become the first abdication of the modern royal era. Lawyers revisited centuries-old legal frameworks, ceremonial teams began designing the delicate choreography of transition, and security services prepared for the global shock that would inevitably follow. Every department was bound by one unbreakable rule: absolute silence. For weeks, only a handful of people knew the truth. Senior members of the royal family were informed in private one by one. Some responded with quiet acceptance, others with disbelief. For those who had known Charles as both man and monarch, the news carried a deep ache, an understanding that an era was drawing to its natural but painful close. Titles, roles, and futures began to shift in hushed conversations behind closed doors. The family, long accustomed to public scrutiny, now found itself grappling with something far more personal: loss. And then came dawn. The palace's official statement, brief, elegant, and devastating, was released to the world. Within minutes, Britain stood still. Newspapers halted their presses. Broadcasters broke into programming. Streets filled with murmurs and disbelief. Across the Commonwealth, millions stared at their screens as if frozen in time. For decades, Charles had been a constant, an enduring symbol of stability through wars, divorces, and shifting generations. Now, his departure felt like losing more than a monarch. It felt like losing a part of the nation's collective memory. Tears mixed with shock. Critics turned silent. Strangers spoke softly to one another outside royal gates, unsure whether to mourn or simply absorb the enormity of what had occurred. Elderly citizens who had watched his lifelong journey wiped their eyes, while younger Britons scrolled through headlines, trying to grasp the magnitude of what they were witnessing. The air seemed to hold its breath, because this wasn't just the end of a reign, it was the reshaping of a monarchy, and the beginning of a story no one was fully prepared to tell. But what if this wasn't an ending at all? What if Charles's abdication was the silent beginning of something far greater? Stay glued. The world holds its breath. Across Britain and far beyond its borders, the news of King Charles III's abdication rippled like an unexpected storm. Quiet at first, then overwhelming. For some, the announcement was met with solemn respect, an acknowledgement of a man who had devoted his entire life to service. For others, it was shock, disbelief that a monarch so recently crowned would choose to step aside. Even long-standing critics, often sharp in their assessments of his reign, found themselves momentarily silenced, realizing they were witnessing the end of a royal chapter that would be studied for generations. The media machine ignited instantly. Major broadcasters interrupted their programming to go live, filling screens with urgent commentary and historical analysis. Every word of the palace's statement was dissected. Its tone restrained, yet undeniably final. Analysts debated the meaning behind its phrasing, political commentators weighed the constitutional implications, and historians were called into studios to trace the rare precedents of royal abdications in British history. What had begun as an official announcement quickly transformed into a collective reflection on monarchy, power, and legacy. From Downing Street to the parliaments of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, political figures crafted statements with surgical precision. Their tone was measured, balancing gratitude for Charles's decades of dedication with optimism for the era about to begin under Prince William. It was a diplomatic tightrope, walked with care. There was no room for missteps. The abdication of a monarch was not a political event. It was an emotional one, a moment that touched the nation's sense of identity in ways no policy ever could. Beyond the British Isles, the reverberations spread quickly. Messages of support and reflection arrived from world leaders, fellow monarchs, and international institutions. The White House called it a decision of deep grace and humility. European royals, many of whom had known Charles personally for decades, described it as a gesture of strength, not surrender. Foreign media outlets devoted front pages to the story, some calling it the end of an age of patience. Others framing it as a renewal of monarchy for a restless generation. In every corner of the globe, Charles's abdication was seen not as retreat, but as transformation. Inside Britain, however, the reaction was deeply personal. Television networks replayed images of Charles through the decades, as a young prince beside his mother, as a passionate advocate for the environment, and as a monarch who had finally fulfilled his destiny, only to relinquish it with quiet dignity. The country seemed to pause between breaths. Strangers spoke to one another in cafes, on trains, and in public squares, not out of gossip, but in shared reflection. For millions who had grown up under his watchful presence, this was more than news. It was the end of something familiar, something constant. Meanwhile, behind the palace gates, every hour was accounted for. Preparations for the handover accelerated with military precision. Ceremonial teams rehearsed in the stillness of midnight halls. Documents, some centuries old, were reviewed by royal lawyers to ensure the ancient protocols could align with the modern state. Advisors coordinated with constitutional scholars, ensuring that when the moment arrived, every step would unfold seamlessly before the world's gaze. Yet beneath the polished ceremony and gilded control, one truth lingered like a quiet echo through the corridors. A father was preparing to let go, and a son was preparing to rise. The transition was no longer an idea or a plan. It was happening, written in ink and bound by duty. Every signature, every carefully chosen word carried the weight of centuries. And as the date drew closer, the world waited, united by a single unspoken thought: that history once again was turning its page. So, what do you think? Was King Charles's abdication an act of quiet strength, or the final surrender to time and destiny? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.